Okay, you should be live. Welcome, everybody. We have an exciting topic today. I'm a huge fan of Shopify's Hydrogen framework because I know the pains of Shopify development for a large merchant on their sort of more legacy system. I love the direction where it's going, and I love specifically the innovation happening on the Hydrogen framework, serving from the edge, personalizing. I mean, all the things that e-commerce needs. It's been hard. Hydrogen's doing and doing in production with large merchants that we can't name, but big merchants are doing this in production. So this is not theoretical technology. This is really built to work with the merchants, the large scale direct to consumer, et cetera, merchants of today. So without further ado, I really want to introduce you all to Brett, who works on the Hydrogen framework. Brett, will you introduce yourself? Tell us, I mean, as much time as you want about your background, your involvement with the project, and sort of how you became to be involved in what you're working on. We would love to hear the whole everything you'd love to share on this topic.
Sure. First off, I guess thanks for having me. We just connected just pretty recently, and I'm excited to be here. I'm excited about Builder.io and what you all are doing, and some of the innovations you're pushing forward with Quick as well. So about me, my background a little bit. So again, I work at Shopify. I'm an engineer on the Hydrogen team. I got involved in so I've been at a lot of startups for the past 14, 15 years, but I got involved in commerce at Salesforce a few years ago in their commerce solution. But I was really excited about Shopify, specifically with Hydrogen and some of the innovation that they're pushing forward, like you mentioned with the Edge framework, Edge first, API first, all that they are really trying to push forward. Really exciting to me. So I've been on the team for about a year now. Yeah, we're really excited. We've got Hydrogen again, like you said. We're in production with multiple 9-figure e-commerce companies, merchants, and so yeah, we're really excited. There's a lot happening. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about it.
Yeah, this is amazing. So, can you tell me a little bit about sort of the what exact problems you're trying to solve and the unique approach Hydrogen takes? I really do think that there's been a lot of talk lately about render at the edge, but nobody's doing it. People will do little rewrites at the edge, but nobody's actually serving from the edge, except my understanding from Hydrogen. There's a lot about modern, faster sort of personalization through server rendering. So being smarter about caching, not just blanket caching the same page for everyone, but being able to do kind of some smarter ways to handle this. So tell me a little bit about like the approach Hydrogen's taking. What is unique about it? What's the point of view here? I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So if you wind back a few years, so for Shopify, if you go back a few years ago, if you look at like kind of the ecosystem of meta frameworks that existed, it seemed like there was a major push for like this idea of Jamstack / host static content. You make a site really fast by like building a ton of pages all up front and just serve it out at a CDN. Yeah, you can make something really fast. But for us, that felt very uninspiring. When I say uninspiring, like what we've envisioned the future of commerce online is extremely dynamic experiences that are way beyond what you could just generate with a static page. So we want merchants on top of the Shopify platform to be able to build like the very best commerce experiences. And if you look at all the other big players, like whether you think about Walmart or Amazon, Alibaba, at any of these major e-commerce platforms, they'll do tons. And like you look at a single page, all the sorts of dynamic things that might happen on one of those pages, everything from potentially A/B testing specific types of content that you might show, to personalization, to localized results. Like, I don't know, you might have in-store availability based upon the location of the person. There is so much dynamic content that might go into e-commerce that we like inherently, we were just very like static generation was a non-starter. And so we looked at the ecosystem, looked it around. A lot of projects at the time weren't really like I think Builder was very young back then. I don't know if they were even existed yet. Remix didn't really exist yet. A lot of things like so we just surveyed the ecosystem. We're like, hey, we need a very dynamic edge first framework that can really serve these types of experiences that we see the future being. And so that's kind of where hydrogen was born out. We didn't see what was in the industry, and so we're like, well, we feel like we can maybe build what needs to happen. And so that's kind of where it started, and it's evolved a lot since then. And we can go maybe into a little bit some of those details, I guess. But that's the origin story of hydrogen.
Yeah, that's perfect, and it makes complete sense. As I saw the Jamstack movement moving towards static, I similarly, both just from an e-commerce background and just the builder product, is all about acknowledging that better experiences are personalized too. You should be A/B testing. Like at the company I was at previously, the initial build, we made a headless site all the way back in 2015. We were live in production, doing like 500 million GMV. We were doing good scale, and it was super interesting process. Adopting things that early comes with a new set of challenges. And, we did the basics of, everybody saw the same homepage, everybody saw the same product and collection pages. And then the obvious thing is, well, that's the generic page is not optimized for anyone. What if you only shop menswear? Maybe we show you menswear products, menswear sort of lifestyle imagery, all that stuff. What if you shop shoes specifically? What if you shop women's wear? What if we've seen you before versus we haven't? What if you're in a different location? I mean, there's so many things. And the other piece is, like you said, A/B testing. If you're not A/B testing or personalizing, like using data to make decisions, you're guessing. And so I'm not a fan of the marketing approach of like, we think this will be good for this week, and we think this will be good for the next week. Why don't we just run some tests and let's find out? Now, as you probably are deeply aware, as you start seeing this, as we saw this proliferation of static sites, this got a whole lot worse. And it was actually scary to me because I'm like, wait, I didn't understand it. I was like, why is the world doing this? And it took me time to realize that, a small to medium website, or a website that's very content driven, like I'm trying to think, why am I blanking on it? Like Smashing Mag or something.
Yep.
They really value extremely fast time to first byte, almost no chance of downtime, right? Everything's pre-built, no server is going to crash. So they're going to serve huge scale at a low cost, etc. But yeah, it really was never a true fit for e-commerce. So it made me really happy to see Shopify embracing this more dynamic approach. Shopify's used a system, their Liquid templating language, for a long time, but because there were certain constraints, it was not like a Turing complete system. You couldn't like fetch data within Liquid. You'd have to move to client side. And we started seeing that for a while too. It was any type of personalization, you would have a website that's returning like a shell, either from Liquid or from your static generation. And then client side, you're fetching a bunch of stuff and then displaying more dynamic, more personalized information. And that had performance trade-offs as well. And so I'm really excited to see Shopify embracing kind of the latest, greatest. So tell me a bit about, I'm guessing it's probably natural that React server components were chosen early on to remove the amount of JavaScript overhead. I'm sure you could look at the average Shopify site and see there's a lot of JavaScript going on. There's apps installed. They all add some client-side scripting functionality because the backend side maybe didn't have everything that was needed for that app. And so with React server components, I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about sort of the decision there, what's going well, or if there's any challenges, because this is still a very new technology, as well as we could talk about kind of moving forward, kind of where do you see all this going?
Yeah. So React server components, maybe to kind of just even explain what those are. And I think one of the challenges is, honestly, with React server components is the confusion that can kind of come with them. And like even on internal to Shopify on our team, like we have new people on board, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. Like, well, what in the world actually is this thing? And how does it fit in with the rest of the React ecosystem? So I guess I'll throw in there, but like part of the reason of like building a framework and choosing React, like you mentioned Liquid and such, like part of it, one of our philosophies, I guess, at Shopify is we want people to be excited to build on our platform. And like if we pick a totally proprietary thing for the future, I guess what I'm trying to say is we want to build upon as much as possible the web platform, web standards, and then technology that the industry is excited to work with. And at the moment, like React, some people hate it, some people love it. But the fact of the matter is that there's definitely a bit of a stranglehold on the industry with a lot of React React devs that just exist all across the world. So that's kind of the motivation of going React in the first place. But with React and React server components, the whole idea of a server component is you want to send less code to the browser. You want to do more on the server and do less in the browser. And it's like painfully obvious when you think about it sometimes. If you've got a page and you've got one checkout button, and maybe that's it, or like an add to cart or something, like, do I really need a ton of like JavaScript sent down to the browser to render all the potentially other content on the page that's relatively static? That's kind of the interest. And I think maybe Quick is also seeing some of the same thing. It's like, well, you might have an app or you might have a page or whatever, and like, how much of it is actually dynamic? How much of it actually needs interactivity? How much of it is static that is not going to change ever? And so the hope is with React server components, at least one of the hopes is that you can render something on the server, send it to the client, and then the client doesn't need to worry about it again. Like, it can get that content from the server and then it's good to go. So like that's kind of one of the key concepts of React server components. Another concept of it, which honestly might be one of the more powerful concepts that I don't think is talked about very much, even by maybe the React core team, is the idea of encapsulation.
Yeah.
Because like a React server component, it's just a component. Again, it's only going to render on the server. And there's some other restrictions we could talk to about them, but it only renders on the server. And it can render other server components, but it also can render client components. And when I talk about encapsulation, I'm saying, like, say you have something like builder.io or some sort of visual builder, or say you're building a platform and you want to use a third-party plugin or widget. Just the idea that you can drag and drop a component and plop it on the page, and that component can like essentially encapsulate a backend for front end for that component and all the client logic. I think that in and of itself is actually pretty powerful. Whereas if you use a different system, like if you have to like wire up some sort of data fetching from somewhere else and then put it in some sort of area where like this component can then like link it into the component, like it's all encapsulated in one thing, the backend for front end sort of aspect, and then the client functionality as well. I think that's pretty powerful. But now let's talk about some of the cons though. So like these are some of the ideas that it's trying to solve, but not like anything in tech. And I'm sure I'm on the Hydrogen team, but I'm not going to I'm going to tell you how it is. There's definitely some cons with React server components, and we're pushing Meta and Facebook, the React core team, on some of these challenges. But one of the challenges is it's confusing. And when I say it's confusing, a server component executes on the server. Well, what about a client component? Initially, almost everyone that starts working on this immediately makes the assumption a client component only renders in the client.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, actually, no. You're like, what? You're like, a client component renders in the client and on the server. And you're like, well, why is it called a client component? That's kind of confusing. Well, and the point is, a client component's like any ordinary vanilla React component. And if you have those on a page, chances are you want to server render those like you would with any normal React application. You want to server render it for SEO, maybe perf reasons. And so that alone is just like a confusing thing that comes up a lot, or has come up a lot, even internal to Shopify, where it's like, okay, I'm building out this client component, and then I'm referencing a browser API like window, and then boom, you deploy it and everything breaks. And it's like, well,
yes.
Why did it break? And it's like, well, it's because you can't directly reference window when it server renders. So you need to have some sort of conditional logic for what it's going to do on the server versus in the client. I don't know. So that's one challenge, is just this idea of it's a little bit confusing. Another challenge, I think, and this next challenge is maybe more representative of worker/server environments. if you look at any given page that's rendered from a worker, say you've got a product detail page, you're looking at the details about a product, there's an add to cart button, whatever. How do you know what data dependencies go into that page? How do you know what requests are going to be made for that given page? Like if you're using Remix, you've got a loader function, maybe multiple loaders if you have nested routers, and you go to those methods to see actually, or those functions to actually see the data dependencies. And inside those functions, you can clearly see, are you like fetching data serially or in parallel, however you want to do it. With React Server components, you actually can fetch data inside the server components, which is cool. It makes a really great developer experience, but it can actually lead to a very poor user experience. Because say you've got like layers and layers of React Server components, and each one of those makes multiple like data fetches. There's a few problems that might come into account. One is you just might not know, like you're tying the data fetching to the React render lifecycle. So for me to know what data actually takes to render a given page, I might need to look at every single server component for that page. Like look at every one of those, which ones actually are fetching data. And like ideally, so like when it happens in the browser, it's super obvious. Say in the browser, you render a page, you client render it, and say and I'll give you an example. We were working with a merchant that, a lot of this was new to them. And they actually had a page that made over 1,000 sub requests to render a single page. And that would be really obvious in the browser, because in the browser, you look at the network tab, you render, and you're like, holy cow, what's going on here? You see request, just drilling down the page. But on a worker, it's pretty opaque on the server. You don't really know what actually happened. And sure, we stream render the content from the server, but stream rendering is not going to really help you necessarily that much. I mean, if you're making 1,000 sub requests, sure, we might show the top of it, but it's going to keep going and going and going and going kind of nuts when really do you need to make 1,000 of these sub requests. So we helped that particular team fix that. But like it just illustrates a challenge of it's just a little bit opaque, and it's a little bit difficult to know what the data dependencies might be when you're interspersing those the data fetching across the React lifecycle.
In that specific example, was that an example of like, let me give a theoretical one, you tell me if this is similar, because I've seen this in cases where you have like, say you're like, I want to well encapsulate a product cell, like a little grid item of a product grid. And you're like, okay, I'll encapsulate it really nicely. You pass the product ID, the product cell will fetch its data and display. And then suddenly you have a grid of 1,000 items. Each one is making their own requests. Or actually another one I know is you might have within that product cell, let's say you want to show a little widget of Yotpo reviews, a little 4 out of 5 star review thing. So each product cell is also fetching their reviews. Is it situations like that where you're kind of creating a mass of components and each item is kind of shooting off some requests?
An example would be like variations. So say you have a product detail page and you have like a selector where you can like select sizes or colors or something like that. And each one of those like permutations of color and size is a separate variation maybe of like the product that you might have in stock or out of stock. And so say you just, said like, well, I want to know all the things about all the variations up front. So I'm just going to like fetch every variation for any given product. And some products might have 100 or more, maybe even 1,000 variations of a product. And so again, if you're just doing a silly sort of simple loop over all the variation IDs saying, give me all the variation data, that's probably not the best way to do it. And then that's a single product. Now you might say you have a product grid, and now you're doing it to the nth level. Now you're getting many products, and each one of those products, you're getting all of the variations. You quickly can get into a bad situation. But that's our responsibility at Shopify. I feel like we want to make it easy for you to do the right thing. We use this analogy of the pit of success, where if maybe you're not a very experienced software developer, so you make some mistakes, but like, is making a mistake falling into a pit of despair where you're just totally screwed? or are you falling into like some intelligent defaults that like help you make the right decision? And that's like, I think probably one of the hardest things to do in software development in a platform is to build those kind of abstractions. It's really hard, and it takes time, and it takes iteration, but it's difficult. And I think that's the North Star for us in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And
I deeply go ahead.
oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I deeply agree on the iteration point. Like you can theorize the most beautiful solution to any problem, and then you throw developers at it and see where their intuition leads them. And it's not what you expected, and it opens new issues. Like here at Builder, we have an extreme sort of MVP mindset, which I've actually seen at Shopify a lot too, even at the scale of a public company, which I love. Which is like have an idea, test your assumptions, don't over engineer the thing, and get the feedback and iterate, which I love. So anyway, I want to let you continue if you had more on that topic.
Yeah, and Shopify is not afraid to make changes. We're not afraid
Mhm.
to to pivot, and we're not afraid of the sunk cost fallacy, and like we're constantly evaluating like how can we make it easier for hydrogen to fall into this pit of success. And we'll have changes coming in the weeks and months to come to make it easier for you to do the right thing. Um, and that's really, really important for us. I think that's paramount. But like, and an example of maybe of an area where we've done that already is another challenge with React Server components with this data fetching sort of thing is you can easily get into a situation where you have a fetch waterfall. And what I mean by a fetch waterfall is say you've got a component that fetches some data. Once it fetches the data, it renders some children. Then those children fetch data. And then once they fetch their data, then they render something. The point is those fetches are serial. You can't start the second one until the first one ends, even if they're completely unrelated. And so if each of those, so say our API is relatively fast, maybe it's 200, 300 milliseconds for a big old responsive data. I mean, 200 milliseconds is potentially pretty good. But if you've got like 5 layers of that where one goes, then another one goes, then another one goes. Now, minimum, we have like at least a second, maybe 2 seconds to render everything. And if those are unrelated data requests, like we should be able to kick them all off immediately up front, which is something natural that you'll get in like maybe I use the example again of Remix with the loaders at the front of Remix where you can fetch it's the loader. You can just put whatever you want in it. Everything happens there before you actually render the page. But to make this, again, this pit of success when it comes to waterfalls, we introduced a concept called preloading. And what I mean by preloading is when a page first renders, what we'll do is we will remember which queries went into rendering that page. When I say we'll remember which queries, we're not remembering the results. We're just remembering that these queries needed to happen. And we're needing to remember enough data about those queries, like, maybe some of the parameters that go into them, so that the next time that route is rendered, we can immediately kick off all of those queries up front at the start. And then as the React lifecycle goes and, like, I don't know, a real fetch happens, instead of doing like another network request, it's just reusing that one that was kicked off at the start of the render cycle. And then, I mean, there's some challenges there with personalization and such, where, we'll want to like proxy like the headers and such from the original request, like that's the current runtime to overwrite the one that was prefetched or predetermined needed to happen. But like the idea again there is like, we don't want you to necessarily worry about this waterfall. Just fetch the data and we'll automatically make sure that we flatten that and make all those requests up front. And if there is a data dependency where it's like you have to do these serially, then there's an option with our querying where you just disable it. So
that's super cool. And that's fascinating. And I'm guessing is when you're saying you're kind of lumping multiple fetches into one request, is that kind of an affordance you get from using GraphQL and that you can actually lump those things together, or is that something unrelated?
That's unrelated. So all we're doing is we're saying these 6 or these 3 or these 5 fetch requests happened. We're
Mm.
just going to say, let's kick off those 5 or 6 fetch requests immediately when the route starts rendering again.
So it's in that
Because
local cache. When it's actually asked for, it's immediately available. Is that the
yep,
approach?
yep.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, and this is maybe a complaint I have with GraphQL, is sometimes GraphQL encourages you to put everything in the single query,
Right.
which sounds great and all, but like if you think about a product page, a lot of your product data might be static, but
Yeah.
some of your product data is very dynamic. So rather
Yeah.
than doing a single request for the product and its availability and other things like that, now the whole request isn't cacheable. Like, whereas it'd be better to like have 2 separate GraphQL requests, one that gets the static data, relatively static, cache that really aggressively, and then do a separate request for the more variable data and have a totally different cache strategy for that. Whereas like GraphQL, you might initially think, no, I want to do it all at once, and there's downsides to doing that.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I remember some early research on like subscriptions and kind of live syncing, kind of like streaming the responses, the pieces as they come, and just that not going very far. I can imagine for a number of reasons. And yeah, I will be honest, in most of my personal cases, I like to just use normal REST APIs, request a resource at a time, parallelize it, and they come back when they come back. Or there's kind of in between solutions, of course, too. Or like you said, treat GraphQL that way. Make separate requests for separate things. Or if you are smart enough to know what's more cacheable and more dynamic, you can split those up. I imagine in an ideal world, and maybe Shopify does this, there's that GraphQL request is actually reaching an edge server that's splitting it up, making the fetches. But yeah, it still has the one issue
Well,
if you need one response at one time.
well, and sometimes like our merchants like GraphQL, like it may be like, say you got a GraphQL request, you're getting the product name, I don't know, the description, a few other things. And it goes really fast. Takes 100 milliseconds to execute and come back. So super duper fast, hitting one of our data centers or edge locations that's really close to you. It's all great. But now you add one property, and just by adding that one property, you don't know, as the person that's creating this GraphQL query, really that has to join 2 or 3 tables, and
Yeah.
it's a really expensive query. And so now what took like 100, 200 milliseconds is now taking 8 or 900 milliseconds. It was just that single property that you added. And maybe if you knew that that was expensive, maybe you could adjust your design. And then a lot of merchants talk to us and they're like, we want to have a really fast site. We want to make this as performant as possible. But sometimes like we're just not sure where the cost is for what we're rendering and what we're showing the user. And this is an area we're trying to really innovate on right now, is how can we expose those costs? It isn't just about the variability of what changes, what can be cached, what can't, but also like what's expensive to pull from the API versus what's cheap. Like it might change your design based upon like what is inherently going to cost more for you to render.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but a lot of what you're talking about in this idealistic world, if the dev tools can just print out warnings in real time as you're developing or whatever, obviously can help. Like I know one thing I've seen is, yeah, say you have this perfectly simple and cacheable, product request, like you said, name, images, description. And then you're like, oh, I also need recommended products. So you ask for recommended products and you have to pass the unique visitor ID or something. And now you've wiped out the cacheability of that whole thing. Versus like respond, if you're streaming with Hydrogen, respond with the above the fold stuff, and then you could stream in the slightly slower recommended that is slightly less cacheable, maybe takes a little bit more work. And one thing I like actually about Hydrogen a lot is there was before Hydrogen, I was in a lot of conversations about, yeah, what does it take to move full server rendering to the edge and make it very performant? And one of the things that frequently comes up is that your data doesn't exist at the edge. It exists in an origin location in many cases. And so it's like, okay, do you bring data to the edge or do you have a clever caching mechanism? And what I really like about Hydrogen is you have some really nice utilities of caching, so you can make sure that you're not overfetching potentially expensive requests, and you can serve on the fly really rapidly. And it seems like all the Shopify GraphQL data is already kind of set up with all the smart principles, and you have pretty easy mechanisms in the framework, as opposed to, I remember making the recommendation to someone, like maybe someone needs to make a product that can do some edge caching of, other third-party services. But really, when it's just built into the framework, you just have the simple local cache. It solves it well. And I really like that you all really thought about that. I wonder if you could tell us about that, like this idea of you're not caching at the top level, you are server rendering on a per visitor basis, or you tell me, and you kind of bring the caching down a layer to keep things fast.
Yeah, so we have two layers. Like you do have the full page cache that you can utilize if you really want, where you can essentially create a static site by just saying on the full page cache, I want this thing to cache for a really long time. That's pretty much just like a static site at that point in time.
Yeah. Can you
But
do that
like,
a per route basis? Like your about page can be statically cached. Okay, cool.
yep, for a single page, you can say, hey, I want this one to be super aggressively cached for a very long time.
And what about, can it be a large, because I'm thinking your about page, you probably want everything cached, but maybe you want to still have an up-to-date, like your cart has 5 items. Is there a way to do kind of a sub page caching in the sense, or maybe you're getting
Yeah.
there?
So that's where we're talking about layers. So the top layer, you can do the full page if you want the full page just to be cached like crazy. Like the cart, so some people want the cart to be like client rendered. So you could do like the full page cache of like everything, and then the cart would have a separate network request or something to client render its actual like value, like I don't know, whatever items you have in it. So that's one way you could do that. But at the same time, you can go down a layer from the full page cache and do what we call sub request caching. And when we say sub request caching, again, if you think about a single page, there might be 5 queries or separate network requests to go get data that might be required to build that single page. And some of those requests could maybe be cached differently than others. And so the idea with sub request caching is like every time you query Shopify's API with Hydrogen, automatically we have default caching in place for every one of those. And the default caching, I believe, is 1 second and a 9-second stale while revalidate.
Nice.
And so like immediately, like if somebody like a flash sale or something really like crazy hits your site all at once, like immediately at the edge, those requests are minimal. They're going to have some sort of minimal amount of caching. So they're going to be minimally actually hitting the upstream Shopify API. Like, but that's probably what you want too. Again, like, do you really like 1 second, 9-second stale while revalidate? Again, we implement all that for you. So just automatically you get that. You can turn it off if you want. You can say with this sub request, this specific individual request that goes into this page, I don't want any caching on that. You can turn it off. Or you could say, hey, I want it to cache for like a super duper long time. You can also configure it that way. And that's really cool because, like, again, just different types of data, it has different, it changes at different amounts of time. And so it's like, what do you want to host for your site, and what type of data requirements do you have? For commerce, I think we can be a little bit more opinionated on, like, Shopify with our expertise and such. We feel like these are good defaults. This is what you should do. Like when you step out of commerce and you're more talking like generic sort of web apps and such, really, it's important to understand these things, but then it's up to you to, I think, determine what your data requirements are, what's volatile, what isn't, and what can be cached.
Do you ever foresee, a curiosity I've had for a while, I think the answer is no, because this sounds complex, but you tell me if I'm wrong. Do you ever foresee a world where there could be a level of kind of on-demand revalidation as well? Meaning like you make a request for a specific product by ID that actually holds in the cache until actually that product changes. Like you go in Shopify's admin, you change the product, that actually can notify those sort of edge workers, hey, revalidate this, it has changed. Otherwise, do not even worry about touching it or revalidating in the background. Is that something that you think you would ever pursue, or is that more like maybe more complicated than it's worth?
So honestly, it's come up, and it's come up kind of in a different way a little bit. Is we have API routes that you could also hit in Hydrogen. Like if you're doing, like, I don't know, your you're submitting a form, or you're checking out, or you're doing some sort of mutation where you want to change data, you're adding something to a cart. I don't know. But say during this mutation event, it's been requested to like provide a way to invalidate cache after a mutation event.
Mhm.
At the moment, we're steering away from that a little bit. Like it might be something we might add down the road, like some sort of way to trigger into the caching implementation that we have. So you could say, I don't know, clear this specific cache key. But the cache key is yeah, we need to brainstorm how to make a good API for that, because sometimes the cache key is generated by us if it's like a Shopify query. If it's any generic query that you're making that is not like a Shopify API query, like you can still use this caching mechanism, but you have to provide a cache key, like a custom cache
Yeah.
key. And
Yeah.
so like it's possible. Like it's something that I think we'd really need to like bike shed on as a team and really understand the cons that might come with that as well. Like one concern that was brought up in I think in the GitHub discussion where it was being discussed is like are you potentially exposing a way for somebody to like DDoS your site in the sense that they could like constantly hit an API and clear out your cache stuff.
Oh, yes. Of course.
But I don't know, like, and again, so like whether or not that's really an issue, you'd have to explicitly expose maybe an API route that does this, and like, sure, you could do that in a bad way. But it's just something we need to really like dive into and really analyze.
Yeah, I mean, you could add your own authentication layer. You can use certain key to run the commands, but I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, I think where you landed is where many people have landed. Even with Builder, we landed. For Builder, we used surrogate keys with Fastly for a while. So, like, when you make a request for some content, we send a surrogate key header of like, here is essentially a set of keys we generate. It could be multiple. And later, one of the key items could be like the specific content entry that was, or a list of the content entries. What we call entries, like units of CMS data that you that the request responded with. Then if you hit publish inside of Builder, we can say, oh, go and validate all those. And so then, update the data to be fresh. To be honest though, stale while revalidate is simpler and just as good. Just stale while revalidate is wildly effective. It really kind of makes it so you don't need any of this stuff. And I can see you landed in a similar spot, and it makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, honestly, some of our most complex logic is in this caching stuff.
Yeah.
And like the classic computer science hard problem sort of thing.
Oh yeah.
And so like if we extend it and add stuff like that, we just need to be careful and very deliberate about it, I think.
Yeah. So also one thing I want to ask, and you kind of mentioned it. So as I've been sort of developing on Hydrogen, so for anybody watching, so the context for me is developing a React server component specific Builder SDK. So being able to sort of drag and drop with React server components, hit publish from Builder, personalization, A/B testing kind of built in. It's all API side, so what data is delivered and renders your hero with these props or whatever, and units of a page that you choose. The ideal for if you really are leaning heavily on server components is that that's all server components. In fact, this SDK has 0 client-side JavaScript, which is cool. The editor runs in real time. And the most useful part is that encapsulation piece that you mentioned, is that when you drop in components, those components could render their own data based on their props. So you drop in a collection component and you say, I want to show this collection. That makes a really nice user experience and developer experience. But as I was using it, I did run into a couple kind of stumbling points. And so one that I think is interesting is just understanding, like somebody asked me to explain React server components, and I actually described it this way. If you're familiar with Astro, where Astro, you write .astro files, and Brett, this might sound familiar. I think we're tweeting back and forth. I included this in there, and I found sharing it with a couple others maybe was illuminating to them. But yeah, in Astro, you write .astro files, and that's where you can fetch your server-side data and print out HTML. And in that HTML, you can reference a client React component, or, as we realized, are kind of hybrid client server, whatever, what we would call, today client React components, for lack of a better term. And in that case, it's really clear. You have kind of multi-page application by default. So server sending HTML, and when you're thinking like Ryan Carniato, creator of Solid.js, used to always talk about SPA versus MPA, and I'm like, I don't know why he's making such a distinction here. And then as I was using Hydrogen, I was reminded, oh, I know why there's a distinction. What you do on the server, like you said, and I know we're saying kind of the same things, but it took me a while to grok this. It's solely on the server. It's not going to, you could serialize some data and pass through, but nothing's going to come back unless you navigate to another page, or there are some interesting other utilities in Hydrogen. So if you take the idea of Astro, you make a .astro, you can have a lot of .astro components, and then you make these mini islands of the React components or whatever inside. And there is a very hard distinction. The Astro component will never re-render in the client, and you kind of respond and forget. Besides, Hydrogen has like session management and other stuff to help with, a user session across the multiple requests in their session lifecycle. And one small benefit of that is you're very clear, am I working on the server or am I working the client? And with React Server components, you do have to remind yourself, this JSX is on the server, this JSX is on the client, and you kind of have to be aware of the whole data tree. Like, am I in a client component that was rendered from a server component and I got some data from the server component? Well, I can't get an update to that data on the client unless I add some other client fetching logic somewhere else. And this is a set of kind of two environments you have to be very mindful of as you do things. And one thing I found in that encapsulation metaphor that got challenging was, in the most ideal world, the builder integration is just one component. And this is something I've wanted from React for a long time, is the component even could fetch its own data, maybe handle some of the nuances of personalization fully encapsulated. But one thing we ran into is like, what you might want to do is, say you have your server component for your whatever page, you have the builder server component, and what if you want to pass a callback through? Because within the server component is a client component, and the callback maybe runs, say someone clicked inside. Well, the problem is you can't pass the callback in the server component. You'd have to go make a separate client component, pass the callback to that, and load that from another server component. So you kind of always have to be very hyper aware of where you are.
This, I'm just imagining someone being like, what? Client component server? What's going on?
I think the better way to say it, if you're not haven't gotten your hands in these things, is you just need to be aware of, like, if you're in this bucket, you have a certain set of constraints, and this bucket others, and they can intermix to a certain degree, but very much not in other ways. And so if you're thinking, what I'm getting at is a lot of what you were talking about is kind of, I think, a reflection of a lot of people are used to being a true front-end programmer. They're used to thinking about front-end client-side React components and frameworks like Next.js, and to an extent Remix, but Remix has its own strategies to move more to the server. So let's say Next.js, you're really used to just kind of serializing client components on the server, and as long as you're not accessing window variables, it kind of feels like you're used to even from Create React App. But with Hydrogen, it is a different world. I'm curious, so you mentioned some places people could trip up and probably some mental shifts that they have to make. I'm curious if there's been other challenges or really key learnings, and kind of where you see this going. Like, one hypothetical thing I imagined is, I could see a world where React Server components are not really the basis for rendering the bulk of your pages, but they're just a clever data loading mechanism. So as opposed to Next.js, where you have to have get static props for your whole page, and they're doing the layouts RFC, you can maybe break it up a few times. So instead of one get static props, like one issue with Next.js people run into is, I want dynamic data in my header. Your header's on every page. You have to add that data fetch to get static props on every page. Well, what if you just said, okay, instead of being all client components or all server components, I just push it down one layer, and my header component can just fetch the data and pass the rest to a client component. At least I've kind of made a cleaner data fetching approach. Anyway, this is just ramblings, but I'm curious sort of how you're feeling about React Server components, where you see it going over time, what your recommended balance has been, just any thoughts on this.
I think kind of inherently what you're talking about there is a real key. I think the future of React Server components I think to successfully use React Server components, I don't think almost ever. Let me put it this way. It's not something like use state.
Yeah.
It's not something like, I don't know, the context API. It's not something that's like, oh, cool, there's this thing from from React. Let me go use it on my existing application. No, it's like a totally different paradigm.
Yeah.
And like, it is super tied to routing. It is super tied to, it's a very low level concept that most people aren't going to interact with themselves as much as like a framework developer would. So the people building Next.js, the people building Remix, the Hydrogen team, etc., we're the ones that are going to have to like figure this out and give you better tools to make it worthwhile. It's not something that you're just going to be like, hey, I want to go use React Server components and build an app with it. That just doesn't make sense like that. It's a low level tool that we need to use to like create a better overall meta framework. That said, I don't know if you've looked at Next.js's like RFC for their new release and such that they're going for. It takes a lot of inspiration from Remix and others when it comes to nested routing and such. And again, I think this is where RSC is deeply tied to routing, because when your route changes, you need to re-render. And when you re-render, if some of your stuff is on the server and it would never come to the client, you always have to hit the server on a route change to re-render. Usually with the normal SPA, you only need to hit the server on a route change if the data changes, like you need to hit an API to re-render or download another JavaScript bundle or something. That you don't hit the server for anything other than that. But with React Server components, like almost like an MPA, like you said, every route change, you must hit the server to ask the server, tell me what HTML has changed on this new page given this new route. And so that's where I say it's deeply tied to routing. And routing, like a key feature of routing is nested routing that becomes important. Like, and I think you kind of implied that with like the header sort of. If your header doesn't change when you're navigating between pages, why do you need to go to the server and say, server, re-render the header? When like you really need to re-render the content below the header. And so that's the concept of subrouting, is like there's a subroute of the content below. When I re-render from the server, I need to tell them what subroute I'm on so that I can have that content only re-rendered. And Next.js is solving that in their specific way. But again, like this is where like RSC provides a very low level like API, and then it's up to Next, it's up to Hydrogen, it's up to others on the exact mechanics of how we like make it actually usable for somebody. And whether like the folks at like Remix, whether they would eventually adopt RSC, I don't know. But like I think that's an interesting sort of thing. I think we're getting away from and I even see it a little bit with sometimes use state where like even use state, it seems like can be even a bit of a code smell inside React code. Like, why are you calling use state everywhere? Maybe you don't need use state very much. Maybe you should be using like React query and other things that are using use state underneath the hood. And it's more of a low level like API that can really screw you up. like maybe you don't need it as much for your actual application logic if you're doing a good job. I don't know. That's something that I'm thinking about, where React is kind of getting to a point where React itself feels like more and more low level. And if I was saying to somebody, hey, they wanted to build a React app tomorrow, I don't think I'd say, hey, go start with create React app necessarily. I'd say, it's commerce, Hydrogen. Not commerce, maybe pick Remix, or maybe pick, Next or something, the new Next proposal. But like, I just manually doing everything seems a little bit scary.
Oh, I agree. I mean, funny enough, last week we had David from XState and Stately talking about the problems with use state. And I mean, it's funny, we see it tons. And it's amazing because we see Jason Miller, who came out with signal support for Preact. And that was especially interesting, not because that's amazing and better for performance. And in my opinion, state management is far better with signals. These reach across components and granularly, cause re-renders as needed. But that was probably the first, at least I observed, concrete decision to completely deviate from the path React is on. And that was super interesting to see. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. He's on the Shopify team, right?
He is, and it's been fun talking to him a little bit about it. I think it's, Preact isn't necessarily like a Shopify thing. It's just Jason Miller looks at Shopify, and Jason's awesome. But like, I think it was very bold and very brave of the Preact core team to run with that, like you said, because it's like the first major departure from the React API with a totally new reactive way of doing data dependencies. Like
Yeah.
that's huge. Like if you think about like what does a UI framework give you, like reactive data in some form or another is like one of the biggest things in any framework. And React gives us use effect largely. That's how you respond to data changes, and fire effects. There's pros and cons to it, but it's just I would say it's very bold by Jason and the Preact team to, whether you like it or you hate it. I think I've heard some people like say stuff like, and again, I don't know what my strong opinion is on it. Some people are weary because they're like, oh man, does this look a little bit like NG model sort of days of like Angular
Yeah.
binding sort of like, or like
Yeah.
Ember data? Is it like Ember data
Yes.
days? And like clearly some people have some baggage of remembering some horror stories of complex apps with Ember data.
Yes.
But I don't know. I think the competition in the ecosystem is really exciting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it actually opens up a new set of challenges for like kind of SaaS platforms like Builder, which is, we're really in a similar way to you. We're very hell bent on a really good developer experience with really good performance and really clean encapsulation. And what's funny is these things sometimes feel like the cap theorem in databases where you can only have two, never three. And it's like, especially performance in DX is always, you're kind of sliding one way or the other, and the middle ground is very hard to achieve. I do. And so, yeah, as all this innovation happens, I love it. Like also Ryan Carniato's work with Solid.js. It's amazing. Oh, you were on his stream, not like, a few weeks ago or something too, right?
Yeah, it was a
Let me
little
get
while
it up.
back. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. A little bit longer, but yeah, I recall that. And yeah, the nice thing is, I think the thing people don't probably know enough about Ryan is he has explored every reactive pattern that's ever existed ever practically. So if you look,
Yeah.
some of the people who have kind of followed his work closely can link you to old GitHub commits where Solid.js at one point used like an RxJS style reactivity. And then at one point it used and it was really interesting actually. It was a lighter weight form. It was interesting, but that's clearly gone or so embedded under the hood, it's not so exposed. There were so many different explorations of reactive patterns. And even with the pattern we chose with Quick, which is a little bit in between what Preact did and what Solid did, he was very much one specific piece of it. He was very much like, you did this part wrong. And we're like, we don't agree. And then I looked at all his research on reactivity patterns over the years, and I'm like, oh, he's going to be right. I know he's going to be right.
Well,
and so what's
but
up?
that's where this stuff's super cool. Like,
Exactly.
so I come from like a science background. I have a physics degree, and this is what excites me about web development, though.
Yeah.
Is like clearly there's no consensus on necessarily the right way to do this stuff. Yeah. And that's where there's a huge opportunity. And I don't know if there's any like younger devs on the stream or anything, but like getting like new eyes on these problems to think about totally different ways to solve them. And just like clearly us as an industry, we still are like grappling, whether it's the cap theorem problem where it's just impossible to get, I don't know. Or like maybe we just need some younger new eyes at the problem that can think outside the box in ways that like older people in the industry were just too siloed or too, I don't know what it is. I just think there's a lot to yet discover and to innovate on. And that's why I love the web development industry, especially like kind of the front end world. Like a lot of people get a little bit stressed because it changes a lot, but man, it's exciting because there's so much yet to be innovated and to be figured out. And it doesn't matter if you're like, Ryan Carniato or if you're Jason Miller. It doesn't matter who you are. If you've got a cool idea, you can totally like innovate and put something out there and wow the world. I mean, because there's nobody's figured it out yet, and it's super exciting.
Oh, I agree completely. And I actually think too that, a couple funny things too. One is how cyclical some of these things are, shifts towards, there's been over time, there's shifts towards code and configuration back and forth, right? There's shifts towards sort of like mutation of data or more functional and functional reactivity too. It kind of cyclical. And maybe that's the the issue why, kind of people who are younger coming in, they don't have that baggage of like, some people who have done the thing for years just kind of start drawing these hard mental rules like, oh, X thing is always bad, and not realizing actually we've learned a lot since then. We could borrow some new patterns, combine it in new ways, and then make something neat. And I think Solid.js does some of that in a really cool way. But also, it's funny to see like when some problems become so significant, they get solvable too. Like as we started seeing this proliferation of front-end frameworks, and to your point, such immense value in the research and everyone having different strengths and weaknesses. And so based on your use case, like you're saying, e-commerce has a pretty kind of well-defined set of good options and less good options, and something different for different verticals or different company sizes, personal project versus gigantic, Amazon.com. And as these problems, with Builder, because of the DX of performance we want to achieve, there was no way we could sort of support this ecosystem the way we needed to without building new abstractions for that new problem. So the problem of fragmentation, you can build our mitosis project is a lot like the LLVM toolchain of acknowledging there's tons of hardware architectures, but people want to write their code one time in their language of choice. So let them do it, and we'll compile down to the different sort of lower level that we need to as our sort of end result for different machines, et cetera. And so, it'll be interesting. We're seeing some adoption of mitosis as well, especially from those who are realizing that this proliferation is increasing, not decreasing, and it's benefiting all of us. In the couple minutes we have left, I want to get your thoughts on one last thing. I know you mentioned some stuff you can't share, even with me or publicly, but is there anything sort of like, what does the roadmap for Hydrogen looks like? Are you kind of in this mode of like, feedback iteration, let's see where the customer feedback takes us and let's refine? Do you have specific larger goals or milestones you're trying to hit, or big areas that have not been developed that you're excited to get to? Like, what does that look like in your mind?
It's a good question. I mean, again, I think the most important thing for us is making sure we have a platform that people are excited to use, and that can build a really good default sort of experience for customers hitting these merchant websites. And we're not afraid to make changes. We're constantly making changes. We're constantly evaluating, like what is the best approach. And so we'll definitely have like improvements to the platform, improvements to the framework, and as those come, we try to also send a lot of. I mean, I guess we could do a better job in some cases, like with some of our RFCs that we kind of just publish out, saying, hey, we're thinking about this new way of doing things. What does everyone think? Is this good or is this bad? And we've got some great members of our community that help out a lot, that just are like sort of tech lead people at some of these merchants that just are constantly on GitHub, giving suggestions and ideas. And that's amazing. That helps us out a lot. But yeah, there's, I think maybe what am I excited about that maybe is next? One of the biggest things is one of probably the biggest benefits of using Hydrogen is we also offer a deployment platform called Oxygen, and that is free. So if you're thinking about starting a custom storefront on top of Shopify's API, like having a free deployment infrastructure is like really pretty cool, I think, for just cutting costs and such. And so I'm really excited about that. We're trying to push for that to right now. It's only available for like plus merchants, which is like our more enterprise merchants. But we're pushing really hard to make that generally available for any merchant on the Shopify network to utilize that platform, which again I think is pretty cool. For it doesn't matter if you're big or you're small to have that, because for us as a company, it's a win-win if you're using Shopify's API and our platform. So that's why we say, hey, we'll offer this deployment network for free.
No, that's amazing, especially because, and this is happening, we're seeing with Quick as well. Sometimes when you're utilizing more modern practices at the edge, server rendering at the edge, there are some nuances to understand when deploying an application that works that way. And to have it just exist and be easy and be free and purpose built. Obviously, Shopify has how many merchants? It's an insane number. I don't even want to guess. Do you have any sense
It's
of ballpark?
a couple million. I don't know exactly.
It's crazy, exactly. So when you're making a very perfect, purpose-fitted solution for such a large audience, so many people benefit. And I really think Hydrogen, the Shopify team, you and your team did a really good job on. I think most people don't realize how hard it is to get defaults right. When you say like, oh, one of the biggest roadmap sort of just directions overall is really good defaults. That might seem trivial to people. That can be an insane undertaking. So much trial and error. It's so much that framework designers think you will use something one way and then you observe it used another way, and you have to find it's.
And then you gotta like sometimes if you change the defaults, then you got to worry about like backwards compatibility and
Yes,
yeah, it's a
it's
challenge.
it's crazy. And I mean, this stuff is so cool. And is there also, if there's anything you could share, one thing that I know comes up in the minds of Shopify merchants too, is one thing that Hydrogen currently doesn't have. And I'm not sure if it's a strategic decision or if it's something to be, there's a plan in place or a kind of TBD. We'll see how things unfold. Two things Hydrogen doesn't have that merchants certainly love. One is just the kind of click to install app store, right?
Yep.
And so obviously somebody could build an integration. You could hit Yotpo's APIs and create your own server component. But do you know if there's kind of what the latest thoughts on sort of app store and app compatibility with Hydrogen is? If one day there will be this more out of the box install and run, kind of like storefront 2.0 on Liquid, or if this is kind of the enterprise developer first solution, this is kind of like your more flexible environments to do things your more customized way. And that's kind of an intentional choice.
So I think there's a few ways to answer that. One is if you look at a lot of the existing apps in the Shopify App Store, a lot of them are pretty like primitive. When I say primitive, they're somewhat jQuery like, where they're going to inject in some sort of template on the page, and then they're going to execute some JavaScript after it that's going to like use some selectors and like essentially start up some widgets.
Mm-hmm.
Like you might have like a reviews plugin that literally just looks for like an ID or something on the page with a div, and then it dynamically generates out like a big jQuery widget style of thing. And so we can kind of support those already ish, depending upon, again, like how the extension or the app was written. Is some are better than others. Some of them like have no way to initialize. Some of them just automatically initialize once the script's on the page, and then you can't reinitialize it. So it's kind of difficult to just blanketly like support all existing sort of apps. Some of them do work, and we've worked with a number of merchants to get specific extensions, like to figure out like will this support, will this not, but just make it drag and droppable. It's a challenge just because of the architecture of existing apps. But that said, we're also like exploring heavily what does extensibility of Hydrogen look like itself. So if we did say, hey, here is the right way to build something that is easily drag and droppable inside a Hydrogen application, what would it look like? What would those sort of hooks or APIs need to be defined by your little app so that it could be easily supported? That's something that's actively being worked on right now, like what that will be in the future, because that's going to be really important.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's something, a little piece of history of the Mitosis project you might find funny is when we started observing the movement to use more modern front ends in e-commerce, especially the Shopify ecosystem, especially kind of the more upmarket brands, one thing we noticed is this does put a challenge on the Shopify app creators, developers, to support, like some are going headless with React Next.js, some are going with React Server Components, some are going with Vue. We have one right now migrating to Quick, and it's like, okay, if you want your app to support all these things in an optimal way, even say, for example, in an ideal world, say maybe your app uses a server component, encapsulate it, can fetch its data, can be smart about it, drop it wherever, until you realize like you can't drop it wherever. You could drop it within a server component. If part of your product details is coming on the client, you need a client component, which has to be written twice. But one of the backgrounds of Mitosis was trying to solve this problem for the app developers and being able to write a React-like component that can generate out to all these front-end frameworks. And you could you don't have to make the choice once I leave the Shopify Liquid environment, which tech stack do I choose of a million? You can actually choose one thing and generate it. In fact, we have one situation now where one of our outputs from Mitosis, which I didn't expect, and now I'm realizing has a lot of value, is the ability to output to a React client component versus server component. So your reviews widget, you could technically write once in mitosis, generating out to a client component using use effects, or generating out to a server component using essentially suspense, making sure you're doing the proper server fetching way, and server state, which would just be local variables. And that's something that, we'll see. That's builders solving our own problems with that, because we need to support Shopify Liquid, Hydrogen, Next.js, all of that. And we have a decent amount of people, not in the Shopify ecosystem yet, building on mitosis for similar goals. So, you can have the back of your minds. That could be helpful in the future if you kind of run into these issues, especially if those app developers, the large ones, run into these issues too.
Yeah, I think we've had a few internal experiments where you could say, like, just on any Leaf node in any sort of application, could you inject in a server component at that sort of spot? We've done some experiments internally, but even taking a step back, in all honesty, so again, if you think about success for Shopify isn't necessarily you are building on Hydrogen. Success for us is the platform. So the more merchants we have on the platform, for us, the better. And so we're just as excited about somebody getting on the platform with Quick as we are with Hydrogen, or if they're getting on the platform with Next or Remix or Solid or Astro. It really doesn't matter a huge amount for us. The hope is with Hydrogen is a lot of merchants come to us and they're just like, you tell us what to do. We don't know what to do. We want something custom, but we don't have the expertise necessarily. We're not sure what to do. And so that's where we want to have this almost yellow brick road path where we can help you do the right thing. But if you've got a competent software development team and you know what you're doing and you're excited about using Quick, holy cow, go for it. Use Quick and make the most awesome e-commerce site in the world on top of Quick. That's we talk a lot of internally at Shopify as well, that it's not a zero-sum game. And in this sense, it clearly isn't a zero-sum game, because the more people building on the platform, the better.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. I'm super excited to kind of understand the merchants' experiences. And I think over time, we'll see a lot of these sort of frameworks approaches blend a bit. If you've noticed, Solid Start, SvelteKit, Hydrogen, Quick City, built on top of Vite. A lot of shared kind of under the hood stuff. And more, you even mentioned too that, maybe there's worlds where pieces of Hydrogen's internals are exposed. So that could be used within, say, a Quick project or something else. Or realistically, everybody's just influencing each other. A lot of Quick City's routing structure was inspired by Remix, SvelteKit, etc. We launched a couple things and we see sort of Ryan talking about adding it to Solid shortly thereafter. There's a lot of really nice cross-pollination. So I really enjoyed this chat, Brett. Really appreciate coming on, going over a little bit. I am just so enthused to see the amazing work and research that you are doing on Hydrogen, that Shopify is embracing with these modern front ends. And thank you to everybody joining in live. Next week, I think we'll have one. I think I know the topic next week, but I will let you know. Brett, let's keep in touch. And otherwise, thank you so much, everybody. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.